Go
Recording?
right ahead.
All right. Uh, this is another episode of From the Grassroots, a podcast about African American history in Alabama and those who have made it. Today, my conversation is with Dr. Richard Dozier, who was an architecture professor at Tuskegee and the first chair of the Black Heritage Council of the Alabama Historical Commission. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Dozier?
Doing fine, Justin.
Yes, sir. Well, and we've communicated by email several times, and just it's really just the tidbits you've given me on your emails have just kind of made me want to know more. So, first of all, I would love to start out with your childhood and where you grew up. And you said, I believe you said your parents were originally from Tulsa.
My mother.
Your mother, okay,
Actually, my grandfather was actually born in Childersburg, Alabama. Her father,
okay,
and he
wow,
left Childersburg. The family left Childersburg to go west, I guess, when Oklahoma, and they had the land claiming, and he moved west in the 1890s.
okay,
And they had been involved in coal mining, and they got into that again in Oklahoma and Arkansas. And then, like I said, my mother she was one of six. She was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, actually Muskogee, Oklahoma.
okay,
And my
wow,
grandfather had a newspaper, the
oh,
Muskogee Star, and then it was a Tulsa Star.
oh wow,
And when the riot occurred in 1921, they indicted him for inspiring to commit, and I forget, it's kind of like the language of today. But he had to leave Oklahoma, so he went to Boston first, and then he eventually migrated down to Springfield and to Buffalo, New York, where he started another newspaper in 1932.
oh wow. And what was his name?
A.J. Smitherman. And it's
AJ?
interesting because Andrew Jackson Smitherman.
Huh. Wow.
And the only other Smitherman I'd heard of before, when I moved to Alabama, the mayor and during the civil rights era of Selma was named Smitherman.
Ah, yeah. Well, and you wonder if.
But there's no connection.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
I don't know. I mean, because there's quite a few Smithermans around. I forget what county that is. Talladega County, I think.
Yes, sir. Wow. Well, that's neat. So you said that was your mother's side?
My mother's father, and her
Okay.
mother was from Arkansas.
Okay. Okay.
And, and my father was from Arkansas, although he wasn't related to they didn't know, the families weren't connected. But they moved from Arkansas to Niagara Falls because of the opportunities in the plants
Okay.
and the work and labor. And one of my uncles, I guess it would be my great uncle, one was a chemist and worked for the one of the chemical companies. And my grandmother and my grandfather lived in Niagara Falls, which is only 30 miles from Buffalo.
Okay.
And my
Wow.
father was a mechanic, an auto mechanic, but at that time they didn't have jobs for African Americans or blacks. So he did a lot of different tasks at the automobile dealership.
Oh, wow. Well, and so what was your father's name?
My father's name was Wilbur Dozier.
Okay. And what was your mother's name?
My mother's name is Carol Maud, Maude Smitherman.
Okay.
And
So, oh, go
she was
ahead.
born in 1912, and she
Wow.
passed in 19. She passed in 2010. She's been gone 10 years now.
Oh, wow. Wow, she's
Lived a nice old age of 97.
yes, sir. Well, that's wonderful, and hopefully we can all aspire to that. So were they? Did they leave Tulsa because of the riots?
Oh yes, my grandfather. The men who went downtown, the way the story goes, they met in his office. He was a real rabble rouser, well, fighting for rights. He believed in, and in those days, if you were black or Native American, will was discovered on your property, you had to have a guardian. I mean, that's how bad it was. And he was against that. And the guardian would have to sell off and approve everything that you did in terms of your money or acquiring things. So my grandfather was a leader among African Americans and a fighter for justice.
Wow. Well, very neat.
And they, after the riot, they met in his office when this gentleman that was arrested for touching a white woman in the elevator. Mm-hmm. They met in his office to make sure that they were not going to lynch the man, and that they were going to stand up for their rights, because this is after World War I. Yes. And so some of them went downtown to the courthouse with their rifles, and somehow a shot got fired, and the rest is history, as they say.
Wow. And I know it from just what I've learned in history classes that Tulsa was the Black District was known as, I think,
Black Wall Street.
Yes, sir. And from what I understand, it was almost completely destroyed.
Yeah, they burned and wrecked his office completely. He had just gotten a new press, and then they burned his house. My mother told the story and would vividly remember how my grandmother, had just made her a dress, and they were in the basement. They hid in the basement while the people were upstairs looting and wrecking the house. Mm. And then they came out and got away, and they went to Kansas first. He had some relatives in Kansas. Okay. And then they made their way ultimately to the east.
Oh, wow. Well, that's amazing. And so it just one more question about that. Did it makes sense. Your grandfather did survive, and
yes, he survived, and he had been indicted, and they were trying to extradite him back to Oklahoma, which he fought off with the NAACP.
Okay.
And there's a lot of records. He was involved with Walter White. There's correspondence between him and Walter White, the president of the NAACP at that time, or the field secretary.
Okay. Well,
and they have now, what do you call it? When they take back his indictment, they now have, realized and come clean with what happened in Tulsa with all these studies. And now, in the next month, they will indict him. And next year will be the centennial of 2021, and we're having a big family reunion there. And in April of this year, they're going to induct him into the Hall of Fame, the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. Journalism.
Well, that's amazing, and that is just so cool. So you come from a legacy of real leaders who stood up for what was right, even in the face of terror.
Yeah, he had quite a legacy, which we didn't hear about that much. He never talked about it very much. I don't think I ever heard him talk about it, really.
Wow.
And as I grew up, we worked in the office, my brother and I come from a family of 6.
Okay.
And I have 1 brother and 4 sisters.
Okay.
And my brother and I, almost all of us worked in the office at some point, as what we used to call my grandfather's office, the newspaper.
Okay.
And for one point, I guess each of us thought we were going to be in a newspaper. I learned how to set type by hand, learned a little bit about liner type and how you put a paper together. But everything now with the computer, all of that is ancient. Yes, but I got away from that in high school, really. I took a little bit of it and began to learn it, but then I was always interested in art. And I went in high school, I was an art major, and then I went in the Navy.
Yeah.
And then when I got out of the Navy, I went out, because I didn't have a degree, of course, when I went in the Navy. And I just began to try to figure out what I wanted to do. I went in the Navy, I was thinking I wanted to be in electronics.
Okay.
And they sent me to electrical school in Great Lakes.
Okay.
Which I didn't like at all. And so I dropped out. When I ultimately came, I did well in the Navy, and I got rate, and I got responsibility. I grew up in the Navy because when I went in, I was 17. When I
Okay.
came out, I was 21.
So, so you were at that. Wow. That. So I just want to double check. I know you said that your father was near, or your grandfather was near Brooklyn or near Buffalo. But did you say you had grown up in Brooklyn?
I spent some time in Brooklyn. My grandmother, ultimately my grandfather's wife, she was a dramatic reader and drama and stuff, and she moved to New York. And so
Okay.
most of the time that I can recall, was somewhere after 5 or 6 years old, she was always living in New York in Brooklyn,
Oh
and my
wow.
grandfather was in Buffalo. So
Okay.
we would go there and spend various amounts of time because it was always good to get away from home.
Oh yes, sir.
So I spent a lot of time in Brooklyn as a young man and or a youngster, I should say.
Okay. Do you remember a lot of any occasions of racism, like growing up in Buffalo or Brooklyn?
No, in Buffalo, Western New York, or New York as they call it, free New York, it's interesting. I never had a black teacher in my life.
Okay.
That's the first thing that stuck out to me when I came south later. But then also it was ethnic divisions. It was Polish, Italians, and blacks.
Okay.
And everybody had their section of town. And Greeks, I should say. When I was real young, there was a whole kind of area that was all Greeks.
Okay.
And almost all of these people they went to school to learn languages because they were first generation. A lot of them coming to the States, and so I had a lot of friends that didn't speak English very well at all.
Oh wow.
But we were all friends, and as young kids, we didn't have any kind of conflicts. But then later, you learn, and when you grow up, you learn more of what was really happening. Like I said, my father could never be gainfully employed as a mechanic, and I'm sure that was
Ah.
because of his race.
Yeah. So he was a mechanic, and what did your mother do?
My mother was a housewife, essentially. Although
Okay.
she went to school, she went to secretarial school, helped my grandfather in his office, and then she had some other jobs, which I don't recall. The thing I remember most, by the time I was a teenager, my mother did housework.
Okay. Well, very neat. So, and I know you mentioned you got into the Navy when you were 17. How did you develop your interest in architecture?
It was just really a fate. What happened, in school, I had always been tested, and every test would show that I was towards a creative side. And so that's one of the reasons why in high school I majored in art. Actually what happened in New York State, when they talk about racism, New York State, they have Regents exams which qualify you to go to college. And if you take the Regents exam, it's a little more restricted and tighter. And also you need approval of your parents to change or get out. Anyway, so to have the most amount of freedom, what people did is opted to have non-regents, which meant you only qualified for vocational school, or you could I forget what they called it. I was a non-college. When I got out of high school, I was not qualified to go to college.
Ah, okay.
It was already set up because of the exams I had taken and this decision I had made, and I guess when I first went to high school. So
Okay.
ultimately, I dropped out of high school.
Okay. So, so you said you were in the Navy. Do you remember any
Oh,
experiences during that
in,
time?
in the Navy, what I wanted to do, I thought, was be electronics, and at that time was TV repairman was a big thing, and people could work from their house, and they went around and fixed TVs. In those days, TVs had tubes and everything else. So in the Navy, I was a radarman ultimately, and that was just by luck. Ironically, when I got kicked out of school because I wouldn't study,
Ah,
and just like I thought the Navy was just like high school, but they said, no, you are, the government has tested you. You're capable of doing this, and if you don't do it, it's direct disobedience of an order.
Yes, sir.
So they kicked me out of school, and this was up in Great Lakes near Chicago. And they had me working in the commissary store, and then finally I got a transfer order to go on a ship, which luckily enough was in the Brooklyn Navy Yard being repaired. And when I went on, it happened that the officer that was on duty looked at my records and everything, and he told me that he thought that I could be a radarman. They needed some help with radar. Okay. So I got transferred. I got assigned to the radar department rather than just what they had just designated. I was just going to be general duty.
Okay.
So I got in the radar, and there was how much you learn, and so you were rewarded for it, and by rank and stuff, and the rest is history.
Okay.
But then when I got out of the Navy, I wanted to go to college to get into electronics and be an ET.
Okay.
And so I started out in mechanical engineering.
Okay.
And I just couldn't stand it. It was just too rigid, and I didn't do very well on 30 seconds of an inch. So downstairs, we were on the top floor, and downstairs were the people in architecture.
Okay.
And at every break, when we go through, I'd see what the architects were doing, and I said, I could do that. That's much more exciting than mechanical engineering. So I changed my major, and I got a degree in architecture.
Oh, wow.
And then it was trying to find a job. That was racism again, ways to say. Now, this was in Los Angeles.
Okay. How did you make it to Los Angeles after the...
In the Navy, I was stationed first. The first on the aircraft carrier went down to Cuba, and then I was stationed in Norfolk.
Okay.
And then I got transferred to another ship, and I came down to Pascagoula, Mississippi, where the ship was being built. And then we went to California. I was based in San Diego.
Okay.
So I was discharged in California.
Okay. And what was the name of the school you attended?
Los Angeles Technical College. Okay. Junior college.
Okay. Now, was it? I guess, was segregation a big deal at that time in education?
Oh yeah. Okay. I was the top of the class, and there were only two of us. Well, architecture in general is not a field that is known for race and integration, even today. Okay. So there were two of us in the class, and I was at the top of the class in terms of grades and everything. And this school guaranteed you a job. Said they could place you. That was one of the things that everybody wanted to go there for. If you got into your discipline, whatever it was, they would guarantee you placement. Okay. Every time I'd go to the counselor, he'd tell me that I didn't have a car. So he said that was too far. You couldn't go for the job interview and stuff. In those days, this was 1960.
Oh, wow.
People rode the bus. There was nothing riding. You didn't think, everybody didn't have a car.
Yes,
so you rode the bus, and the bus went everywhere in L.A. It just had to take a little more time. Okay. But at any rate, I didn't get a job. I couldn't be placed. And so when I finally finished, the last route they sent me to a big engineering architecture firm out in L.A.
Okay.
And I started out working for them.
And what was the name of that firm?
It was Kistner, Wright and Wright. I'm not sure if they still exist even today.
Okay.
They built a lot of Century City in Los Angeles.
Okay. Wow. So were they African American or was?
Oh no, this was a major white firm. This was a large firm. Like maybe they had maybe something like 400 or 500 people.
Okay.
They had engineering, architecture, structures, and they had all the different divisions. Okay. And there was one black architect who was in design. Everybody else, they didn't have any other. They had some Koreans and Japanese, but they didn't have any other blacks.
Huh. Okay. All right. So, how did you? We've got you in California now. So how did you? Did you go from there to Alabama or to Tuskegee? How did that work?
Everything is by, I often get asked this, and I often say my response is, I didn't have a master plan. I didn't start out saying I was going to be an architect. I started out saying that I was going to be an engineer in electronics and blah, blah, blah.
Yes,
and then just got, I got kicked out of school. And then it just happened that when I went on the ship, they put me in radar. And then when I came out, I got into mechanical and didn't like it. And then I chose architecture only because they were downstairs. Once I got into it, I began to like it and understand it and everything, of course, from school. And then what happened, I got married, and my ex-wife now, was from Detroit. So we had some issues in L.A. They broke in our house and a couple other bad breaks. So we moved back east, and she didn't like New York. I was wanting to go back to New York City, and she didn't like New York. So we went back to Detroit.
Okay.
And in Detroit, I had met a couple architects while I was there visiting. So I went to work for another large firm first, which is now still, they exist now as, I forget what they were active on this African American museum in D.C.
Okay.
They were the engineering firm. I forget the name. It was Giffords. No, I'm trying to. It was. I can't. Smith Henchman. It's the Smith Associates now.
Okay.
So it was Smith Henchman and Grills. I went to work for them, and did well. And architects go back and forth. In those days, there were these very large firms where you could spend your day just doing details for one project.
Okay.
Or there was the small firms where 5 or 6 people, where maybe 10 or 12, where you had more responsibility. You had the whole, from the client all the way through.
Okay.
And so everybody wanted to work for small firms. I tried to get in touch with Paul Williams, only black architect I ever heard of.
Okay.
And I didn't get a job, couldn't even get an interview there.
Huh.
So I went to work for a small firm.
Okay.
In Detroit.
Okay.
And after I worked at the big firm for about a year, and then I went to the small firm, and I went back and forth. At the time, I didn't have my license, and my degrees were not accredited, so I needed another degree.
Okay.
So from Detroit, I got the great opportunity to go to Yale. I got recruited to go to Yale.
Wow.
And I got my master's from Yale.
Huh.
And I just continued on community design, and it was at that time, the architecture profession was going through a lot of things with the cities, the Watts riots, and then Detroit riot also.
Yes, sir.
And so there was a lot of realization that they needed more minority involvement. At least they believed that if you could help people understand more what architecture did, there could be a better environment and blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
So I went to Yale and got involved with the American Institute of Architects.
Okay.
And setting up community design centers and making design more relevant. And from there, I went to University of Michigan. So, I got my license.
Okay.
Now, that's why I went to Yale, to get an accredited degree, as they called it.
Okay.
And I got my license, and I worked for my senior professor for a while.
And what was his name?
Charles Brewer.
Okay. Okay.
And then from there, I went to, what happened, that's how I go to, what happened, I was going back and forth, and I met, at this time, it seems strange when you go back, there were so few black architects. You didn't even know a black architect, not a real good, friendly social basis. And so I met my first one, who happened to be Max Bond, who was teaching at Columbia. He was chairman of the department.
Okay.
And we spent a lot of time talking, and a lot of the what-ifs, and talking about design and so forth. And his father had taught at Tuskegee a long time ago, in the WPA era.
Now,
Max,
was that Horace
Max told me about the HBCUs. I didn't know a black school at all at that time.
Okay.
And so Mac's first thought was I was going to start teaching at Columbia. They were going to try to recruit me from there, from Yale to Columbia, because I was on the faculty at Yale.
Okay.
And what happened, they just didn't buy it, you know. And then the City College, and so Max was always telling me about Tuskegee and conversations and things that he remembered about it, because he was actually, I guess he was born there in Tuskegee, actually.
Mm.
And grew up and graduated from Harvard at a very young age.
Wow.
And at any rate, he kept talking about Tuskegee, and an ad came up where they were looking for a chairman of the Department of Architecture at Tuskegee.
Okay.
So I went. I applied, and I got the job. And as they say, the rest is history. So I moved from Fifth Avenue in New York to Tuskegee.
Oh, wow.
It was quite a change.
Huh.
But I enjoyed it because the other problem at Yale was when I was on the faculty for 3 years there, I think I can count the black students I had in my class, because there weren't that many, and there still aren't any black students in the school to speak of, in the School of Architecture.
Hmm.
So every time you're not having an impact. You're saying, what am I doing here? You start questioning it, and like I say, we talked to Max a lot, and then Max's partner, they had their own firm, and his partner also taught at City College.
Okay.
So we would have several conversations about architecture and what it meant to be an African American, and so forth. And there was never any knowledge of history. I mean, Max would mention people that he knew, architects. I never heard of them.
Huh.
So when I go to Tuskegee, one of my big things, and I get there, there was a man that graduated from MIT in 1892.
Wow.
And headed up the Tuskegee Department of Architecture under Booker T. Washington.
Okay.
And nobody had really heard of him, or they heard of him. They didn't talk about him very much. But I had the great occasion to meet Booker T. Washington's daughter,
okay,
who was married to an architect, William Sidney Pittman.
Okay.
I met her before she died. She lived in D.C.
Okay.
And she started to tell me about the architects at Tuskegee, and how her husband was so temperamental and didn't get along with Taylor, the guy who graduated from MIT.
Huh.
So I began looking into more and more the Tuskegee architecture program.
Okay.
And that's my dissertation.
Okay.
I mean, when I go to Michigan, I decide that I'm going to write about Tuskegee.
Okay.
Wow. And as they say, the rest is history again, you know. So it's not like I had a plan. It just kept evolving. Because when I met Portia Pittman, Washington's daughter, you know, I didn't know much about Tuskegee's architecture department at all.
Wow. Well, that's amazing. So when you become the head of the department, I guess in an architecture school, what are some of the main courses that you would teach?
Well, design studio is the primary part. Design studio, in a typical curriculum, accredited curriculum, they want you to spend, I think it's 9 hours in the studio.
Okay.
And a typical faculty member teaches one studio and one lecture course, sometimes two. The lecture courses are your typical college courses of 3 hours.
Okay.
The studio runs Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, usually from 1 to 5 or 6. And of course, everybody's gone by 5:30 or 5.
Okay. Wow.
The courses that and so in design, you're always trying to come up with projects to design. Typical beginning problem is an artist residence or some kind of, and so many black folks haven't had any kind of firsthand experience in those days with the residence and all this kind of way out art and stuff. So, but in the meantime, there's a lot of history that we didn't know anything about, like plantation architecture, slave builders.
Yeah.
slave quarters, African American contribution to architecture, African architecture.
Yes.
I had gone to Africa by then twice by the time I went to Tuskegee.
Okay. When was that? When did you go to?
Well, I had a Fulbright once I was at Yale still, right before I started teaching at Yale when I graduated in 1970. I went to West Africa.
Okay.
I went just on that time. I just went on a straight up. I went with CORE, I think, an organization from New York put together.
Okay. Well, very neat. So how did you get involved with? Did I know that that AIC was developed, I think, around 66, 67. How did you get involved with that organization?
Well, what happened there when everything is like I said, it just one thing. It's just fate. If you study history and you look at history, the first thing you start to realize is how many buildings and things we're losing, and there's almost no history on the cultural landscape of the African American contributions. Yes. The plantations, they say, Mr. Jones built. Seldom do you see a plantation home where there's one in New Orleans, one or two in New Orleans I can think of, or near New Orleans, that was built by slaves where they say that. Most of them say that the plantation owner was the architect. And they don't talk about the slaves at all. But the slaves were actually the builders and the artisans. And in several cases, they were the architects. And why that's important is because if you're starting to study architecture, you got 5 years in front of you, and you don't see any role models, and you don't think you've ever made any contribution in architecture, you say, well, hey, this is maybe just not for me.
Yes, sir. Wow.
So what happened is, once you start teaching the history, then the next thing that comes up, I got asked to be on the Alabama Historical Review Commission.
Okay.
And one of the first projects, all the time, what I did was discovering what I just talked about is how every time they list a plantation home, the slave quarters were not included, or they called them the secondary buildings, where it's just the reverse.
Yeah.
The secondary building very often is the large building, and the smaller building, the slaves where they lived and cooked and ran the plantation, they're the primary buildings.
Yes,
pick the cotton.
Yes, sir. What?
And so I got on the review commission, and that was, I forget when that was. That's in the late 70s or somewhere around mid-70s.
Okay.
And I started having more and more to do with the historical commission.
Okay.
And then the director they got, Larry Oaks, was a great guy.
Okay.
And one of the next projects that I really remember outside of Plantation Home was the park. The 16th Street Baptist Church was listed on the register. It was up to go on the register. And so we voted and it got listed. But then one of the issues we had was the park, the adjacent park where they had all these demonstrations and everything. That space was just as important as a church.
Yes, sir.
Even, to preserve it. So we listed that. And the rest, I just had a really great time on the commission. Met some more people from Auburn that were in archaeology.
Okay.
And architecture. And Milo Howard was legendary, was the head of the review board at that time.
Yes, sir.
And the governor, of course, was Governor Wallace.
I've heard stories about Milo Howard, and that's like that he was him and what there was the first director of the AHC, Warner Floyd, who was fired because of his doing. Were you involved with the commission at that time?
That time, Warner Floyd and Milo Howard. Milo Howard appointed me, really.
Okay.
Well, he nominated me to get appointed.
Okay. Wow.
And then Warner Floyd was there. And so that's what got me into, preservation. And then I went to a national trust training session for preservation out of Marshall, Michigan.
Okay.
And I met, I can't even think of his name now, I met the keeper of the register.
Okay.
I can't think of his name, can't recall his name.
Okay.
But he came down to Alabama and spoke at Mobile. Milo Howard had invited him.
Okay.
And we started talking about at Tuskegee having a preservation program and had him come over. And we had a number of people come to Tuskegee while I was there around preservation.
Okay. Do you remember some of their names by chance?
Bernard, no, I get mixed up with my, because from Tuskegee I went to Rome to study preservation.
Okay.
That capped off my, and I just started saying, the keeper of the register, I can't think of his name.
Okay.
And then the gentleman who taught at Columbia, who founded their preservation program, he came down to Tuskegee.
Okay. Okay.
And Tuskegee has all these buildings. You know, Tuskegee is like the Mecca, I say, of African American architecture, because it had all these early pioneer architects, and the students made the bricks.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Wow. Well, very neat. So, talking about AIC, and I know you were talking a little bit about your work with the Historical Commission, but did you, and I know you had interaction with Charlena Bray. Do you remember any, I know you emailed me that it was a grant that you were developing for, or that you acquired for.
Right. I got a grant from them to survey architecture of black colleges.
Okay.
What started happening, I started realizing there was a lot more in the state. You know, Alabama and North Carolina have the largest number of HBCUs in the country.
I didn't know that.
And so Alabama has, I think it's something like 6 or 7 now, still. But, and I wanted to see them. So I went, with that grant, what I did was went around the state and looked at all of them. And I didn't have, and there wasn't anything readily available that you could even find out, what they had, what was on the campuses.
Yes, sir.
The other thing that led me to that grant was I did a survey for the state of Georgia on African American historic sites.
Okay.
And how to identify them and so forth. And I used the same methodology. I looked at a couple studies that I had discovered, and I drove around and I saw I visited all the schools that were existing.
Okay.
And one of the, I guess, 2 stories that really stick out, Talladega.
Okay.
I mean, I had barely, heard of it very much, and that's the oldest HBCU in the state.
Yes, sir.
And they have a building that was built by slaves for whites, the Savory Hall, the oldest building.
Okay.
It was built as a school for white students, a Baptist school. And then one of the slaves who had built it had pushed to say that, they wanted, when Talladega, he pushed for the legislation that got Talladega College established.
Okay.
And that's their great building with the winding stair hall and the great columns and everything. I mean, it's a signature building.
Wow.
And the oldest building.
Yes, sir.
And then what I did, I just went to all the different schools. Not all. I went to all the schools in the state, photographed them, looked at them, and dug out essentially what they had, what they thought. The other big discovery was the murals at Talladega, both at Talladega, all at Talladega in the library.
Yes, sir.
And I guess have you seen them? They've had a national tour.
Oh, yes, sir. I think they built an actual museum back at Talladega for them. I think they're the Amistad murals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They were in the library, and the librarian said, "Let me show you these." And they have such a history. At that time, I guess now maybe there's more written, but at that time there was none.
Wow.
And the other school that stuck out was the Seventh-day Adventist school, Oakwood.
Okay.
And then it came up later. I was on a team from Department of Interior when they were trying to select schools to give a priority for preservation.
Okay.
And Oakwood was a representative of Alabama. We went there, and their building that they had that was nominated, they had torn all the parts off trying to make it ready for the team to come.
Oh, my word.
So there were 12 buildings, and that's the only building that got disqualified.
Okay.
Because they were trying. Now they have since restored the building. The building is East Hall. It was their first hospital.
Okay. Okay.
So Alabama has a real rich, and then I have a student, Clay Dorsey, who has practiced in Birmingham.
Okay.
A former student, I should say. And he worked on the lynching museum there in Montgomery.
Huh.
But anyway, Clay is real resourceful, and he did the Tuggle School in Birmingham. It's not a college. At that time, it was just considered a high school, which was almost college.
Okay.
And they just did a new building, and he is the architect for their new building. It just opened last few years in Birmingham.
Okay. Wow. So all of this, when you were doing these surveys, was this like late 70s to the early 80s?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay.
Because I leave Tuskegee in 80, I guess it's 87.
Okay.
And that's when I go. I wanted to go further with preservation, so I went to the International Council of Monuments and Sites, the school they have in Rome. I applied for that, got it, and I went over to Rome for the next year.
Okay.
And then when I came back, I went to Michigan and did my PhD and did, as I said, the dissertation on Tuskegee.
Okay. Okay. So, I guess getting through your time with AIC, how did you, and I know you were involved with the Historical Commission, how did the Black Heritage Council come about? I know that Loretta Wimberly was key in that and different things like that.
Yeah, what happens is that's all in that same era, but it's really not. I did the AIC grant, and then the mayor of Birmingham, Richard Arrington at the time, was wanting to do a lot of things. But what happened was, I was on the review commission and for AIC. They had sites here and there coming up around the state, African American sites. But there was a need to be together, and then they would have meetings, and you find yourself as the only African American person there.
Mm.
So as I said, Larry Oakes, the director, was a open-minded and a good, solid guy, and we just told him we needed to have something of our own, and he agreed. And there was another lady whose name I can't recall, was Alabama State, who is now passed on. And this was before Dexter Avenue wasn't even listed. She was a member of Dexter, as I recall.
I think that was Zelia Evans.
Exactly.
Yes, sir.
And so anyway, then what happened, we started meeting informally, and then Larry Oakes gave us a sanction, and we set up the Alabama Black Heritage Council.
Okay.
And what we wanted to do was have a representative from each, just like the Historical Commission, have a representative from around the state. So we picked all the people, and we had them come to a meeting. I got elected chair.
Okay.
And then we started proposing annual meetings and archive and the whole bit.
Okay.
And a lot of it got done, but so much of it, I've discovered after, like, there was a gentleman that was on it that had been the president of, I guess he had been the president of Talladega.
Huh. Okay.
I can't recall his name either. No, yeah, he was the president of Talladega.
Okay.
And he was on some commission in Montgomery, and he was on the board. And we had some good people, and we got a lot of things done. One of the things we wanted to do was find out what was happening in the state. And then they hired Frances Smiley, the state, and she did the first directory of historic sites in Alabama.
Yes, sir.
And there were so many things that we were on the cutting edge for, because the other thing they did was they established a regional committee. I forget the name of that, too. But Frances Smiley, do you have the guides that she did?
Yes, sir, I do. Yes, sir. That was really it's revolutionary. That whole thing. It's actually one of the big things that kind of made me want to delve into Alabama's Black history more. So.
And then the other thing that was with all this at this time, the National Trust was operating with regional offices, and they had a regional office in Charleston,
Okay.
and a southern regional office, and we were very, we were like leaders in a lot of ways with them.
Huh.
The model, I guess I should say, because now several other states have a guide, but Francis Smiley's was the very first one that came out.
Okay. Wow.
And we were attempting to get, like I said earlier, a preservation program at Tuskegee, but it never kind of got going.
Okay. Huh.
Then what happened, I was at Tuskegee twice. I had left and went to Rome, and then after that, when I finished my dissertation, I went to Morgan State.
Okay.
And then Florida A&M.
Okay.
And then what happened, I heard, there were several kind of grumblings going around. HBCUs, there at that time, there were 7 of them. And they were having a lot of difficulty getting accreditation.
Okay.
Because architecture schools are expensive. That's the first thing. And then trying to get people to stay and recruiting students. And they had been on Tuskegee for a long time about having a critical mass and a number of students they had. Their school was small, but it was good. It was thorough.
Okay.
And they had a tremendous success rate in terms of architects getting their license. But at any rate, they lost their accreditation.
Oh, wow.
And I just said, no, that can't be. I mean, Tuskegee it's just too important. So I left. I went on leave, technically, from FAMU and went back to Tuskegee.
Okay.
To now, with all these things that we're talking about now, I didn't know at that time when I first went there.
Wow.
So we got the school, first thing was to get the school reaccredited. We got the school reaccredited, and then my leave was coming to an end. But then we found out that we could only get 3 years accreditation. We couldn't get 7. So that meant that we'd have to start writing almost again right away. So I resigned my job at my position at FAMU and came back to Tuskegee full time.
Okay.
We got a grant. We found out more, and we pumped more Robert Taylor stuff in there. We found out that Robert Taylor's grand niece was Valerie Jarrett.
Okay.
And then we got the Taylor family to make a donation to the school. We got the school named the Robert Taylor School.
Wow.
And then Valerie Jarrett was our dedication speaker.
Oh, wow. That's...
So those are the things that we got accomplished at Tuskegee. And then, of course, I retired. I retired from Tuskegee.
Okay. Well, I know, I have to say, I think one of your former, I don't know if he was a former student or not, but I've run into a Tuskegee faculty member, Thomas Kaufman.
Oh yeah.
And he's done a lot of interesting research just on, I think he's worked on bells. Yeah. But I think the last time I spoke with him, I said I'd been trying to get in touch with you, and he told me to tell you hey. So, yes, sir. But so when did you leave Tuskegee for the second time?
The second time I left in 14.
Okay.
2014.
Okay. And I know that you've since that time, if I'm not mistaken, did you move to Tallahassee, I believe?
I moved back. Oh, yeah. I didn't give up my house here.
Okay.
So I moved back here, yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And have y'all, did you start I'm not sure, what did you do, I guess, in your post-retirement?
Initially, I did a few things. I taught a course on, ironically, on the Tuskegee Airmen. Not
Okay.
about architecture per se, but about the Tuskegee Airmen in general. It was a discovery thing. That
Okay.
was with Florida State. They have a lifelong learning program. I
Okay.
got involved with ARP. I was on the board for ARP,
Okay.
and then I did the OLLI course, lifelong learning. So that's the first part. I was doing things like that. And then I took a thing on leadership Tallahassee,
Okay.
and then I found myself too busy.
Yes, sir.
And so a few years ago, I stepped down from most of those. And now what I work on is just telling myself I want to put this. My goal is to have an archive at the
Okay.
University of Michigan in Tuskegee.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to that. That's amazing. Um, so eh, one there have been a couple of resources I found just researching your name and especially with the National Museum now in Washington. I've run across. I know there was a program you did in the 70s in Tuskegee, and I think they have that online now. And but I also know you were part of a symposium a few years ago.
Oh yeah, they just have one. The woman, she's doing some interesting work now. I'm at a loss for names here.
Okay.
Yeah, that was an excellent thing. They brought together. What was the name of it? Forgotten Landscape or Broken Landscape?
I yeah, I don't have it with me right now, but yeah, and I know you mentioned there's and this name passes me. His first name was Whitney, I believe.
Whitney Young. Yeah, Whitney Young.
Yes, sir. And from what I understand, I mean, what was his story?
Well, Whitney Young, and I guess I gloss over a lot of things. When I was, let me place it. When I was in Detroit, right, he was a speaker. When I told you I got recruited to Yale,
Yes, sir.
one of the things that they tried to do, they being the establishment, was to have urban coalitions in urban America. I mean, everything was, they had to find an answer for it. This is LBJ and the civil rights era.
Yes,
So
sir.
Whitney Young was the type of man who would just go and tell people like it was. So he told them in the beginning. He said, in architecture, the thing that's most noticeable about you in civil rights is your thunderous silence.
Hmm.
And that became the clue for everything not everything, but quite a bit happening in the AIA. In fact, they established the Whitney Young Award.
Wow.
And they give to the minority architect that's done the most over the years. At the same time, the National Organization of Minority Architects was being organized.
Okay.
But Whitney Young, they had an organization called the Urban Coalition, which was the movers and shakers of let's say against urban renewal. There was, I can't think of the different organizations that were in that.
Okay.
But they had, and Detroit was considered to be a place that was pretty progressive.
Okay.
And so they had their conference in Detroit.
Okay.
They would have an annual conference. And Whitney Young was the speaker. What happened, that's when RFK got assassinated, whatever year that is.
Think
And
68.
so the mayor from Detroit was supposed to be the speaker. And he had to go out to L.A. because of the assassination.
Hmm.
And so Whitney Young spoke.
Okay.
And then they set up a program following all of that. They had a program called, I get such a loss for names here. But they worked out an agreement with the AIA to where the architects would agree to have a internship for minority architects.
Okay.
And so they had quite a program with it. And then the Ford Foundation has funded the AIA some money for scholarships.
Okay.
Now, there's very few of those people that got those scholarships around. Now, one of them was at this meeting in Smithsonian, at the Smithsonian. But what I was going to get at, the lady who put that together, I think I recall her name being Valerie. She's now at Harvard on a Loeb Fellowship.
Okay. Wow.
and she's tracking down drawings of African American architects.
Okay. Wow. And I know one here in Alabama, of course, I know there was, like you say, Robert Taylor, but then I know there was also a man named Wallace Rayfield.
Wallace Rayfield, right?
Yes, sir.
I did a talk up there with what's the park, the Vulcan Park. There was a
Okay.
man up there. Oh, I think he was over the education program.
I think Mark Ackerman, I think.
I might be. I think so.
Not sure.
Kind of rings a bell. A
Okay.
couple things just happened to come together that year. Have you heard of the name Major Holland?
I haven't. Major Holland? I haven't. No, sir.
He's retired also now, but he was one of the architects on the Paul Rudolph Chapel in Tuskegee.
Oh, okay.
And he
Wow.
taught at Tuskegee. I mean, when I went there, he was legendary.
Wow.
I mean, he started anyway that year. They gave him the Architect of the Year and the Contractor of the Year. The Construction Association and the Alabama Architects had both awarded him Architect of the Year.
Oh, wow.
And so they had a big conference up there, and I was up there kind of for that. And then also trying to think of the occasion that this man wanted to do this thing. I guess they were just doing something on Rayfield.
Okay. Well, it's like you say, it's amazing. Just even now, the like you say, when you were first teaching at Tuskegee, most people didn't realize the importance of slave artisans and construction in building the plantations. And then even now, it's it black architects are more well known, but still there's gaps in knowledge about just recognizing their work.
It's coming out. And now that you mention that, and I think about Auburn, and I'm sure you've heard of the work of Vincent McKenzie's work, which nobody is quite sure where it is. Vincent McKenzie, he was a librarian. I guess he might have. Now you're with the state, right? You're not with Auburn's library.
No, sir. I taught quite a bit with them, but no, I've never heard of Vincent McKenzie. That's interesting.
You heard of the man who? He wrote the book on Rayfield.
Okay. Okay.
What's his name? He found the Rayfield plates.
Okay.
And he hired Vincent, or he got Vincent involved. And when you heard about the Rayfield plates, right?
I believe so. I have the book that was published, but it's been a while since I've looked at it. But the Rayfield plates, where were those? Or
Well, this man says he found them in a barn. He's a real estate developer.
Huh.
And he found them in a barn in Bessemer.
Oh, wow.
There's a booklet. It's not a book. There was a historian in Birmingham, black historian, who wrote about Rayfield. The first place, I was still in New York.
Huh.
The first place I heard about Rayfield. And then when I came down, he had already passed. But in the area where, in his book, he talks about Rayfield and his house and all the things he had in his house.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, long story short, the house got demolished, of course.
Oh,
it's in the area, I forget the exact area of Birmingham. It's not in Smithfield, it's in another area. But anyway, at any rate, they tore the house down, and so everything was gone. But this guy comes up in the newspaper saying he found these plates in Bessemer.
Wow.
And they're all Rayfield's hand-drawn. A lot of things, apparently he did lithographs when he printed these books and stuff that he did.
Oh, wow.
So this man has all those, and he did a book and an exhibit, and that's what I was up at the Vulcan Museum for.
Okay.
They did something on him up there.
Okay. Wow. Well, that's amazing. Well, there's just, like you say.
The history in Alabama is now another person you should know. I'm trying. Margaret is her first name. She's a historian in Birmingham. I'm sure
Okay.
you've heard of her.
I I haven't. I've the few historians I've heard of in Birmingham, black historians. I know there's Horace
Now this
Huntley.
woman she's a white woman. She
Okay.
led the team for the Rayfield, the 16th Street Half study.
Okay. Okay.
Have you seen that?
I haven't, but yeah, I'll definitely dig into that and see. That's that's amazing. Um.
And another architect in Alabama is Kippy Tate. And I'm trying to think of his first name. Kippy. I mean, everybody in Alabama knows Kippy. He
Okay.
was a state architect for a minute. He was one of my first students at Tuskegee when I first went down there the first time.
Okay.
And he's now in Montgomery. He's at Tuskegee. He's vice
Okay.
president for development, in fact.
Okay. Wow. Well, this is amazing. It's weird how you those names just come up in your memory and just you know kind of going through that. That's amazing. Um, I guess um, sort of trying to wrap, just kind of bring our conversation to a good conclusion. How are there any major things that come to mind on your reflection on your career? Like, I mean, any I guess lessons you've learned, or just I guess any comments you want to make on your career?
Well, I guess, to be timely, again, just by fate, Congressman Clyburn that just did all this for Biden in North South Carolina. When we were doing the Department of the Interior study, the way they had it, the government gave grants to HBCUs for preservation. But in order to get the money, you had to do a 50% match. So if a building's going to cost $2 million, you had to raise $1 million.
Yeah.
And Congressman Clyburn was instrumental in getting that deferred, and so that they didn't have to have the match, or the match was less.
Okay.
Otherwise, preservation had been at a standstill at HBCUs. Then they got more money. And then Tuskegee, again, going back, Tuskegee is the first HBCU to have a park service on site.
Oh wow.
So some of the things, or the thing that I think of my career, is the first people to be involved with the Park Service on a professional level are Tuskegee people.
Okay.
The people who ran the MLK project and did all this stuff, they came from Tuskegee. They're Tuskegee architecture graduates.
Okay. And do you remember their names by chance, or?
Jerome is one of them that did the church in Atlanta.
Okay.
And then I'll try to think of them, and maybe I can send you something with their names.
That would be perfect.
But if you, most likely, Troy Lismore was the park superintendent at Tuskegee.
Okay.
He was the first black professional with the Park Service, and I know he's still alive. He's in Atlanta, I think. He's retired.
Okay. Wow.
But up until the time of Tuskegee and the Park Service, this is like 76 when they got listed on National Register when I first went there.
Okay.
And the Park Service and HBCUs and preservation was not. And the other thing, I guess one other thing I had a Getty grant that we just finished up.
Okay.
So preservation, not only architectural history and involvement of blacks in architecture is now taught in most schools, whether it's not a course, it might be at least mentioned. But preservation is very active.
Yes, sir.
African American preservation.
Yes, sir. Well, that's amazing. And again,
a lot more than you wanted.
oh yeah, that's perfect. And I think we could do more, but we may want to wrap up for today. But this has been just a wonderful conversation, and I'm so glad I got to speak with you. And because a lot of this history, I mean, it's told in bits and pieces, and I know at the state archives we have the records of the Alabama Black Heritage Council, but it's still there's still bits and pieces that you can only get from oral history and conversations with people. And one thing I found interesting in looking through the Black Heritage records, there was in a lot of the meetings, were there nicknames that y'all had? That, to me, that's fascinating. Like, I think, how did those originate? Just curious.
I think, it was just kind of a way that people operated. I have such fun. You know that, talking about HBCUs, that Alabama State was founded up there in Marion.
Yes, sir.
I say up there. Because one of the last projects that I worked on at Alabama, last time around, we were doing some stuff with Lincoln, because they have restored the auditorium building, but they still have a couple different buildings up there that haven't been restored, and they had some great photographs. They have some records, and we were trying to get them. In fact, Kippy Tate was involved in this, went up there with me a couple times.
Wow.
But they've restored, the state has restored the auditorium building, but there's still other buildings that were part of that school that are not restored. It's a senior citizen. I think I forget what, it's some kind of a senior feeding program. They got a grant.
Yes, sir.
But that's a history that should be, connect that back to Alabama State. It's not done. And then the fact that, and when you mentioned the nicknames, that made me think of, that Andy Young was his wife's mother, was very active in the Alabama Historical Childs.
Oh yeah, Idella Childs. Yeah.
And she was real active and would tell you stories. It's just sad that we didn't have the capability to record a lot of that stuff.
I know. Well,
a lot of the stories.
Yeah, and I'm kind of trying to see how to develop this into, I guess, into a business. Right now I'm just doing this just for the desire to get these recorded, but I'm hoping to eventually develop some kind of business or a collaborative or something. But anyway, it's, again, this has been wonderful, and I'm sure I'll probably have more questions in the future, but this has been wonderful speaking with you.
Well, it's certainly been my pleasure, and you got it all on tape. That's a good thing.
Yes, sir.
And there's numerous people there I'm sure that'd be happy to help and have some other input, like Loretta, and then, like I said, Kippy Tate is another resource and then I'm trying to think of some of the other people on the Alabama. So many people are retired now. The Alabama Council of Architects.
Okay.
And then NOMA, they have a NOMA. There's an architect, there's a black architect who's an early Tuskegee graduate, in my era, who has an office downtown. Robinson, I think.
Okay. Well, I'll look into that.
But and then with Tom Hoffman, he's also a resource. Well, okay. I hope it helps. I'll look forward to hearing from you again, and look forward to hearing your progress.
Yes, sir. Well, and you've been so kind, and yeah, definitely I'll be in touch. And again, I wish you continued luck with retirement, and just again, it was wonderful speaking. So.
Okay. Well, I thank you, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Okay.
Yes, sir. You too.
Okay. All right.
Bye.